All right, so this week we're going to talk about jQuery. I'm going to use this video to introduce you to what jQuery is, how to use it, and how to find resources so that you can use it even more than what I'm going to give you on the video. So first, what is jQuery? jQuery is free open source JavaScript library, which simply means that jQuery is JavaScript. It's a library of JavaScript files that somebody else has written for us. jQuery is tested for cross-browser compatibility, so we don't have to worry about making our code. We don't have to test it. We don't have to try and add if conditions in order to make sure that all of our click events work. If we use jQuery, everything will be cross-browser compatible for us, and we don't have to worry about it. And we'll look at an example of what it means to say that the jQuery lets us have access to the DOM quicker than the onload event that we've been using prior. So, JavaScript libraries. Well, what is a library? A JavaScript library or any kind of library is a collection of code that somebody else has written. So they've made complex tasks simpler. They've already created all the code, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. And if we utilize their code in their library, our lives get simpler because we just use their code. We don't have to keep rewriting it. So the idea behind jQuery is exactly that. Someone else has taken JavaScript and made complex tasks easier for us. It's important to note that it doesn't extend JavaScript. In other words, it doesn't make JavaScript better by giving it more functionality or more this or that. It's simply libraries that is using JavaScript that can automate our code for us and make it easier for us because we just run the method instead of having to write all of the lines of code to create something. We'll see examples of that in a minute. So why would you use a library? Well, it makes things faster. It speeds up your overall development time because we don't have to write all the code someone else does. We just call their code, their methods, or their properties, or whatever they've already written for us to make it that much quicker to get up and running. And it provides standardization. So just as long as we see the syntax, we know automatically what it's going to mean, and therefore it makes it easier for us to maintain and easier for us to read someone else's code, that kind of thing. Why use a code library? Well, it shortens the learning curve to some extent. You still have to learn how to utilize the features of the library, but it certainly can make JavaScript easier. That's kind of a catch-22 because I think it's important to understand JavaScript in order to use jQuery. So as long as you know JavaScript, perhaps it shortens the learning curve because I don't have to learn all of the steps to do something. I can just use jQuery's method and it's going to do it for me. There's a lot of different libraries out there. There's a lot of different additional jQuery libraries like UI libraries and so forth that we're not going to talk about in this video. But just like anything else, there's lots of libraries that are available, so we can extend things that we are producing that much quicker. Disadvantages to libraries, well, it can foster ignorant use of the language. Sometimes people might jump in and they don't know really how to code, they don't really know what they're doing, they just plop libraries into something, hey, it seems to work, and that all works great up at the beginning, but then maybe they did it for their brother or their uncle or something like that, and then their uncle says, well, can you do this? And since they don't understand how the library works, they can't make the change. And so then they get stuck and then they become enemies with their brother or whatever. I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, oh, my brother's best friend's nephew can build me a website. And that's because that person understands that I can just plop in a library and things are going to work. But I can't tell you how many jobs I've gotten on the side because of the fact that someone else's brother's nephew's sister built them a website utilizing libraries that then they didn't know how to maintain or change because they really didn't understand what they were doing. So disadvantages to libraries are certainly that. Well, let's jump in and figure out where we can find jQuery and how that all works. So if you go to jQuery.com, which I will attempt to do here. So this is jQuery.com. This is the definitive page for finding anything you need about jQuery. It's their website. And if we look where I'm going to start now, that's beautiful. Look at that cross-browser spinning. So if we look down a little bit, we'll get back to this download jQuery button in a minute. But this is a great place to go and explore. In fact, I would highly encourage you to start getting comfortable with looking on websites for the documentations of any language that you're going to be learning, whether it be jQuery, whether it be JavaScript, whether it be C#, whether it be whatever it is. Start to get comfortable with going to that web page and reading that technology's documentation. It's its instruction manual, so to speak. But the more you get comfortable with that, the quicker you'll improve your skills in any language. So I'm going to take you to this jQuery core API documentation. And this is where you can find all kinds of documentation on how jQuery works. This is a good place to start or to play around in. Let's see, and then of course W3 Schools, which we'll look at in a minute. So I'm going to go back to our slide. API jQuery.com, that's this page that we were on. So that's where jQuery resides. That's where the documentation is. Just like we did in Bootstrap, if you recall, there are two different ways to add jQuery to your HTML. One is to download the library files. And I'll get back to that page in a minute. We saw that little button I brought your attention to. You can download two different versions of that file. You can download a minified version, or you can download an uncompressed version. And the way that I know that the difference is because this one says .min.js and this one does not have the .min, and we'll look at that in a minute. You'll also notice that there are different versions in jQuery, and this particular version is notated in this file name 1.11. So you can always see what version you are currently using, or if you're maintaining someone else's code, what jQuery version have they utilized in their code. And if you look at, let's go back to the home page here, jQuery.com. I probably could have typed on that logo, but if we start to look at downloading jQuery, I'm going to click on that button. You should see that there's quite a number of, I guess that's on another page, so there's quite a number of different versions out there, but we're currently on the 3.21 version. And maybe you need to be aware of it, because maybe you need to be compatible if you're maintaining someone else's code. You need to be compatible with a prior version, 1.1 or 2 version. So it's always important to pay attention to that file name so you know which version that file you're maintaining is currently on. But if you're using the newest version, you're writing a new code, then of course use the newest version. So let's look at that idea of compressed versus uncompressed. So if you look down at the status bar down here, I can't hold both at the same time, you'll see that this is the minified version, jQuery 321.mn, and I'm going to click on it so you can see what a minified version is. So it's just basically the jQuery non-compressed version, but you can see that all of the white spaces disappeared. You can sort of pick things out, but the computer doesn't care about the compiler, the interpreter does not care about white space, but it makes it difficult for humans to read. So if we look at the uncompressed version, you will see that this is what it looks like, and that's something that you could read. I'm not expecting you to, but it's the code behind the jQuery, and it's the unminified version. So the minified version is better for production because it's going to load faster. But if you're using development, you might want to use this uncompressed version. So anyway, back to the slide here. So you obviously, as we just suggested, you have the option to download the minified version or the non-minified version. And then just like we've done in our JS files, you can make a link to it to your local file with a script tag. The other thing you can do is link to a CDN, a content delivery network, and there's quite a number of them out there. So utilizing Google or Microsoft in order to link to their stored version of the file that you're interested in. And again, I will take you there. If I go to Google and I type in jQuery CDN, the one I would use most often, I personally use most often, is Google's. So I find this hosted libraries, Google developers, and I click on that. And this is CDNs for lots of different types of libraries. Angular JS, you can see Angular, blah blah blah. So if I go down far enough, and I can't see it on the right hand side here, but there's the menu. So these are all the different libraries that you can, that Google will host, but this is the one I'm interested in, and that these are all JavaScript libraries, by the way. We've kind of talked about that. jQuery. So here's version 3, here's version 2, and here's version 1. So you can just copy and paste that particular script tag into your file, into your HTML file, and you can utilize the CDN for that jQuery. So again, that's the minified version, which is good for production, so there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so that's how you could link to a CDN. Okay, so let's actually use jQuery. That's a bunch of talk, but now that we've got a jQuery file, this is how you access the jQuery library. You can either use jQuery parentheses, which isn't used very often. More often what you'll see is this $sign, which is a shortcut for this jQuery method. So these are synonymous, but you'll see this $sign used as a shortcut way more often. So I'm going to W3 Schools here for my reference. What another great reference. So let's go and I'll show you where I found this just to give you an idea. So if I go back to, I'm going to go into W3 Schools, and if you click on References, sure enough there's a jQuery reference right here, and this is the page. This is where I am here, jQuery References Selectors. You can see that right here, and you can certainly go in here and play with some things in here, which I highly suggest you do. Before we go too much further, if I click on it, well, there you can see that seems to work, and I'll explain that in a minute. So if you click on Try It Yourself, you'll see an example of it. And what I wanted to bring to your attention is at the end of this video, we're going to talk about what this particular function means, but you can certainly see that there's a $sign and some things. So let me just share in my video what we're doing, and then we'll come back to that. So the way that this works is the $sign references jQuery, and if we put into quote, these are called selectors, and if we put into quotes, a selector means anything that you can select one of your elements. For example, this asterisk selects all, but this should look familiar. If we use the ID hashtag and last name, then this is going to select all of the IDs, well, should be just one, but all of the IDs with the ID name of last name. So ID equals last name. Here we've got class, all elements with the class of intro. Okay, so that should start to give you, well, okay, what can I do with that? So now I can select all of the elements. That's kind of slick. So kind of what we were doing with get element by ID, except this is much quicker, isn't it? So the next part of this is that we have our selector, and then we have a dot action. And here you can see where I got this particular copy. If you go to, let's just go back there so you can see it. So I'm going to close out of this. So I was here under syntax. Let's see if you can, if this helps. So jQuery tutorial and then syntax. So jQuery tutorial and syntax was right here. So this is where I got this particular slide. So if you want to go through there to refresh yourself. So the idea here is that you use your selector, and then you can use all types of methods that are available to do something with that selector. This one's hiding the selector, for example. So anything, oops, didn't mean to move ahead. This simply means this element that you're referring to, the current element that it's attached to, but let's make it simpler. This would be the P tag. Hide all the P elements. Hide all the elements that have a class name of test, etc. So let's look at this in action. Here's some sample code. It should be attached to this, so you can download the code or type it in yourself. But we're looking at, this should look familiar. First of all, I've created a button that's on click get text method or function. So that function runs, and the function will alert. So there's my alert box that we've already seen. And in the alert box, you see the $sign. So that means jQuery, utilize jQuery's library, parenthesis. The selector is the ID second, so that's this paragraph here. And then .text. Let's go back to W3 Schools and under jQuery HTML, jQuery get. So let's look at that. Oops, wrong one. So jQuery, if I scroll down to jQuery HTML, jQuery get says that this is a way for me to get content. Sets or returns the text content of selected elements. So here we can see this is me getting the text. You can also see that, we'll talk about this function here in a minute, but you can also see that button1.click. Okay, so you're starting to see this syntax, correct? So there's selecting the ID of btn1, and we're going to attach a click event to it. Here's an alert that is getting the text of this ID. So I'm going to go back to my example. Mine is a little bit simpler than that, and it's simply saying run this function and get that text for the ID of second. So I'm going to go into Atom and pull up get text. And this is exact same code, preview in HTML just to make it easy. And so the idea is if I click on this button, alert, and sure enough, it does just that. Okay, so let's go back. Let's look at another example. Okay, so this example is this is really cool, but again, right off of references, HTML, CSS. This is many methods that are available with it, but I chose this one that's called toggle class. And toggle class is toggles between adding and removing one or more classes from selected elements. So let's see how that works. So, let's see, I probably should start here. We can do it here. Okay, so toggle class. All right, so what's happening here is, let's just see what we recognize. Well, okay, here's a script tag with, let's just get back to that in a minute. There's a style, so I'm setting a style for if P has a class of striped, that text is going to be green. Okay, so we have a paragraph. This is just paragraph 1. Here's the paragraph that has an ID of second on it. I have an input button that on click is going to run a function. So nothing, I don't have anything, any P tags with a striped class, correct? So what will happen then is on this button click, let's go run that function stripe, which is up here. And here we can see that where there's a $sign, so we're utilizing the jQuery library. We're selecting any ID that has the ID name of second, which is this second paragraph here. And then we've got this toggle class and striped. In other words, it's going to toggle back and forth between having striped on and having striped off. Let's look at that. So where's my preview? Oh, here we go, preview. Okay, so right now I have this second has no class applied. Our second paragraph has no class. All right, so if I hit the click button, you can see that it toggled the class on. So right now, striped has been applied to, P has been given that class striped, and the coloring has therefore been applied. If I click again, you can see that it toggled itself off, so it's back to the default now. So toggle class literally toggles a class on and off on that click. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so we're starting to see how simple jQuery works. We're starting to see jQuery is recognized. We recognize jQuery library using that $sign. It's followed by our selector. It's followed by that dot notation, and then a method that we want to run, and that we can look all of that up in W3 Schools or in the jQuery API documentation. This is just that file we just looked at. All right, things get a little bit more interesting now. Now we're going to talk about the document ready event. And you can find this documentation under the jQuery tutorial, jQuery syntax. So where was I here? So if I slide up to the top, jQuery syntax, and if you scroll down, this documentation is down here. So I got all of these examples from right here, but I'll just explain it utilizing the slide that I've created for you. Oops, didn't mean to move forward. So in the past, what we've been doing in JavaScript is we've been using the window onLoad event. And I know this function part looks kind of new to you, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But for now, just recognize that when we use the window onLoad event, what that meant was when all of our elements are DOM loaded and all of our images loaded, once everything was loaded on that page, then the alert button would come up, or that alert box would come up in this particular example, or whatever it was we set up. Well, jQuery is a little different. If we use the document.ready and this fancy function thing, which I'll explain in the next video, for now just take it at face value. What this refers to is once all the DOM elements are on the page, in other words, so we can access any of those DOM elements that we want with our selectors, but the images might not have loaded yet. Maybe the page is still loading some of the resources. Maybe the video is still loading, or the images are still loading. Well, that's the difference. In JavaScript, the window onLoad would wait for all of those images to be downloaded before it got fired. With the jQuery document ready method, or event, the code would get fired as soon as the DOM elements are rendered, but the images might not still be downloaded yet. So it's much quicker to get at the DOM and start to get at things that need to be manipulated. So you'll see a lot when people are writing jQuery that all their jQuery will reside inside this function. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. Sometimes a shortcut for the document ready, you'll also see it written this way. This is the same thing, this $ function parenthesis. I think this is more common because it's a little bit clearer. So you'll definitely see a lot of document ready function. And like I said, we'll explain this function here in a little bit. But for now, just kind of get the idea of how this works. And if for the moment you need to memorize the syntax. It gets a little confusing because we've got this parenthesis, and then the ending of the parenthesis is down here. And then we have this function that doesn't have a name. And then we have the parentheses, the curly braces. So just recognize that syntax for now, and like I said, in the next video, I'll explain a little bit more of how and why that works. So here's an example of how to set up our document ready function. So in our script tag, I have document.ready function. There's that funky syntax you just explained to me. And there's my opening curly brace, there's my curly brace, there's my opening parenthesis, there's my closing parenthesis, and then the semicolon to end that entire function. And what you'll see here is $, so jQuery library, for all of the P elements. At the end of all of the P elements, append some text. And again, I found this example is in W3 Schools under jQuery HTML and then jQuery add, so you can go look that up. So let's look at it in Atom. I'll actually run it. So that is document ready. And so let's just do the preview HTML. And you can see that it automatically appended that. As soon as the document was ready, all of those P tags got appended, some appended text. Well, this isn't really pretty, but it shows the example of how that document ready function is working. And like I said, in the next video, we'll look a little bit more about what this function is doing. Why doesn't that function have a name, and why is that syntax look so funny? But for the moment, at least get the idea that all of our code now is going to be within this. All of our code. Let's see, how do I word this properly? So all of our subsequent code, all of our jQuery code or all of our JavaScript code will now be inside this function. So this is kind of like your opening and closing body tag. So that way all of these things will be available at the time that the DOM is ready. Not at the time that the images are finishing loading, but at the time the DOM is ready. So all of our tags and elements will be in place for whatever subsequent calls we need to make, or get element by ID, or now we have these selectors that we want to apply to it. Okay, I think that's all I have for this particular video. Kind of jumping you off the deep end. I highly encourage you to go explore W3 schools and start playing with a lot of those things. I can't possibly explain them all to you, but just jumping in and starting to use the resources will not only make you good at jQuery, but also make you a good coder, because it teaches you how to start exploring the documentation and exploring how to utilize the documentation without having to go ask a teacher, which won't be available to you when you get out in the workplace. So the next video, I'll explain about those functions, and that is jQuery.